Now we're going to create an application that calculates the paycheck amount for an employee based on the number of hours that he or she worked that week. We're going to make sure to add an exception handler in this application, so if the user by mistake entered a string instead of a number, our application will not stop working. I added the controls to the form and the application, so now what we're going to do is we're going to add the code under the calculate button. So we're going to create the event handler by double clicking on the button. And now I'm going to read the number that the user entered. And after I create the application, I'm going to add the exception handler to my application or to my code. So I'm going to define two variables. One is to read the number from the user. The other one will be to save the results of my calculation. Anytime you do any calculation in your application, it is good practice to save the results in a variable by itself. So you would have a little bit more control on the output or on the results. DIM. And since I'm going to be reading a number of hours, and we're not going to take any fractions, so the employee can only work either a whole hour or no hours whatsoever. So I'm going to define it as an integer. For the total, I'm going to define it as a decimal because the pay per hour is $15.32. Since it has fractions, I'm going to define a data type that accepts fractions. The appropriate data type to use is decimal. Since pay per hour is something that is not going to change that often, I can define it as a constant. A constant is a variable that you define in your application that doesn't change that often. An example of that is the tax amount. States do not change their tax amount on a regular basis. So instead of having a variable that you read from the user many times, you can just define one constant and you use that constant in your application. To define a constant, you start with the word constant, then the name of the variable. In this case, it's going to be pay per hour, then the data type. In this case, it's going to be decimal. A constant can have different data type. In our case, it's only going to be decimal since the pay per hour is going to be $15.32. With constants, you do not read them from the user. You assign them immediately. One thing I like to do is I like to divide my code into four main sections, especially when I start reading information and do calculation in my application. The first section is going to be define. This section will have all the definition of different variables I'm going to use in my application. The second part is going to be assign. In this section, I'm going to assign the variables, whether they're going to be read from the user or they're going to be read from somewhere else or from a different button or a different procedure. So in this case, int number is going to be assigned to the variable that the user entered. Before we do that, I need to make sure that I'm reading an integer, so I'm going to use the built-in function cint, which is convert to integer. Now I'm going to read from the text box, .text. Since I'm not reading any more variables, now I'm going to move to the third section of my code, which is the calculate. And in this section, it's going to include all the different calculations that I might have in my application. The only calculation in this application is the total paycheck amount is going to equal to the number of hours multiplied by the pay per hour. That concludes the calculation part for my application. The final thing is I want to make sure that I'm going to send the results back or the output back to the user. So that is the last part of my application. It's going to be the output. In this section, I'm going to send the output to the user so he or she can see the results of this application. In this case, I'm going to send the output to LBL result. I'm going to add a short message says your paycheck will be, and since now I have two different types of output, a text, then I'm going to read a variable that I defined. I need to make sure that I'm using the ampersand or the and sign. And now I need to include the other type of output, which is the paycheck amount saved in the variable called DEC paycheck. So I'm going to quickly check that if my application is working or not. Then I'm going to add the exception handler. I highly recommend anytime that you create an application, try to test the output. Manually calculate what the output should be, then try to test your application. If the output did not match what your application is supposed to do, that is a different type of error. It's not a syntax error, it's not a runtime error, it's what's called a logical error. The output does not match what it's supposed to be. And in that case, you need to go and make sure that your calculation and the assignment of the variables you have in your application are all correct. So I'm going to test my application. I'm going to enter the number of hours as 10. This should be an easy output. So 10 multiplied by 15.32 should be $153.20. It seems that my application is working. Now I'm going to add the exception handler in case the user entered the word 10 instead of the number 10. To avoid this runtime error, I'm going to add the exception handler. To add an exception handler, you type the word try, then you click enter, then you move your code inside the part between try and catch. In the part between catch and in try, what I'm going to do is I'm going to display an error message to the user to alert the user that he or she entered the wrong data type. So now I added an exception handler to my application. I will test my application again and see if my exception handler is actually working. So if I enter 10, it displays the right output. If the user entered the word 10, the exception handler seems to be working. One thing I want to point out, you notice that since it is a paycheck, it should have the $sign next to it. To add the $sign, you need to use a built-in function called .toString. .toString is a built-in function in all numeric variables or all numeric data type like integer and decimal. And it has different formats. The format that we use for currency is called C or C2, which stands for currency. So we're going to add that to DEC paycheck and display the amount in dollar amount or in currency format. To do that, we just add .toString, parentheses, double quotation. Then between the double quotation, you either you put the letter C in lowercase or C2. Now when the user enters 10, using the .toString currency format, the number is going to be displayed in currency format with the $sign. We just created a simple application that reads the number of hours from the user, calculate the paycheck amount, and we used a constant to save the pay per hour.